This is the Metal-Arc Venus65. It's a 65% with a strange 2x4 key ortho layout around the arrow cluster and a fingerprint sensor at the top right. As I begin, I open up the case and there's some rather nice foam. It's a little spongy but stiff enough to protect the kit, so I don't fear it getting damaged in transit. Under the foam, there's some wax paper. I assume it's so that the case and parts tray / novelty box don't get scratched, but I don't know what they were thinking was going to scratch the board, considering even the case itself is also wrapped again in some PE foam. This one even has that vaporwave woman laser etched into it. Finally, getting to the internals, PCB, the case, and the foams, along with the plate. Swear to God, I started to feel like Brendan Fraser from the 2008 hit movie Journey to the Center of the Earth. Like, just digging through this till I can find that Tootsie Roll center of the Tootsie Pop, but the PCB has a strip on the bottom that needs to be snapped off prior to installing. I used some needle nose pliers to bend it, and that seems to help as long as you got some leverage to work with. But just make sure that you place it flat on the edge of a table so you don't bend the PCB itself while bending that part off. Off to the right, you can see the novelty box. This is solid CNC aluminum, and it's currently filled with some of the parts that we're going to be using to build the board, including the fingerprint sensor, a few LEDs, and some of the bump-ons. Now to the board itself. The CNC job looks good, the coating is clean, even, and it doesn't have chipping, but I do notice very, very fine transition errors where the tooling didn't perfectly hit a curve and it left a little bump. They are not plainly visible, but they are there. Do you see these screw holes? And how there's 8 of them, but only 4 screws in 4 of them? That's a problem, and I'll explain why later. I wanted to take the weight out of the board to look it over, to see if there were any imperfections in the paint or the CNC work before I started building it. And honestly, I don't even know why you can remove it. The weight is solid aluminum, and so is the rest of the case, so they could have just made this all a single part. If the designer decides to release new weight materials or designs or paint jobs, then it'd make a little bit more sense, but as of right now, the only way you can get any use out of being able to take the weight out is to swap it in with a different case's weight, which means you'd have to buy 2. The total weight comes out to about 418 grams for the weight itself. The top case comes out to about 345, and the bottom case is at 322. This is a total weight of 1,087 grams, or about 2 pounds 6 ounces. Now to open the box of dreams and mysteries. Inside, there's a little folded up piece of paper with their brand logo on it, because brand recognition is important. But seriously, the paper has 2 cables you use to connect the fingerprint sensor. You only need 1, but they give you a spare, which is nice. Along with that, it has gaskets, which are very clearly bump-ons. And they aren't good ones. The fingerprint sensor is screwed into the top left of the box with 2 screws, and they can be discarded. They are too long to put into the case. This box provides 2 other shorter ones, which you will be using to mount the sensor. Alongside all these, you find 4 LEDs. The colors are purple, blue, white, and I believe a yellow-orange one. I didn't end up using that one, so I do not know for sure. If you want to swap these out with different colors, you need to look for a 4x3x2 millimeter diode. No, RGB will not work. It requires more pins than you have available on the PCB. After putting everything aside, I tried putting the rubber feet on the bottom. I noticed that the feet were slightly larger than the places you were supposed to mount them to. I do not know for sure if this was a tooling issue with the case or a cutting issue with the feet, but either way, they were too large to fit in the holes. That is the problem with the black ones. However, the clear ones were so terribly cut, you would have thought a 12-year-old with safety scissors had done it. So, I did eventually swap them out with some other bump-ons I just keep in my stack of hoarded materials for keyboard building. I then began installing gaskets. These are standard Power-On foam strips that you just stick on with an adhesive backing. Usually people install them onto the plate that you plan on using, but others, myself included, will install them onto the case itself. That way if you want to swap out the plate at a later date, you don't have to add more gaskets. I use a razor to help me install them, as it allows me to stick the gaskets on them lightly and place them flat and aligned rather than cramming them into place, and it also allows me to get into the fine nooks and crannies. But be careful, because it is a razor. Wouldn't think I'd have to mention that, but apparently I might. Susan Wojcicki might fucking RKO me if I don't. Next, I had to install the sensor. This is where I used those two smaller screws that came in the aluminum box. A little piece of advice I can give is to install the cable onto the sensor first, since the orientation you have to install it at makes it kind of hard to reach after it's screwed in. All you have to do to install it is pull out the plastic bracket thing for the cable a little bit to loosen up the latch, and then slide the ribbon cable in, reseat the latch, and the cable is good to go. The cable is symmetrical, so either end will work just fine when installing the cable, but if you see the side with the blue squares, put that facing down. The text should be visible from the back of the sensor. I am an idiot who did not do this. Here you can see me struggling to install the cable a little bit. This is because I did not think to install the cable before the sensor. Now to work on the PCB. I spent some time looking at all the foams to make sure that the process that I needed to install everything in was correct, as sometimes companies will cut out gaps for the stab wires to fit through on the foam sheet, which allows you to install the stabs first and then just place the sheet on top, but other companies won't cut these out and requires you to place in the sheet before the stabs. Speaking of stabs, time to lube them. I'm using TX, which are super nice and easy to work with because the packaging does a good job at protecting the wires from getting bent during shipping. This board does not come with any stabs, so you do need to provide them yourself. Personally, I recommend TX if you can get a hold of them, or KBD's Dyboux stabs, because they also do a good job at protecting the wires during shipping. They're easy to work with. They have a slight leg up compared to Duroc V2s, in my opinion. If you don't know about TX stabs or why I'm using them, they have a rubberish plastic molded inside of the stem, so when the wire hits the top or bottom of the stem, instead of ticking, it bounces off and has a lot quieter sound. They are very easy to work with, and their wires are super straight, and it just makes it overall a much nicer quality stab. It's also the reason they go out of stock within minutes of release. It's fucking annoying. I lubed mine with a small amount of BDZ on the wire and some 205G0 on the outside of the stems. I won't be talking about the process of lubing, so if you would like a more in-depth video, I recommend Alex's or Teja Types. They both did really good videos discussing the process and how to make sure wires are balanced. They go over the entire process of stabilizers. As I was installing my stabs, my camera died, so we're just going to jump forward a little bit. After installing the foam sheet and the stabs, I needed to test them, which means I need a few switches. For this build, I'm using Texi Purple Pandas. They're a 5-pin, 68-gram bottom-out tactile with an all-PME housing and a palm stem. They're slightly more expensive than some of the other options that I have in my collection, but they're a great tactile because they have a nice snappy feeling. Some of the others I have are a broader feeling of the bump where you feel it kind of roll over. These are a lot more crisp and snappy. They more just slam into place. I won't be talking about the sound because sound is useless in terms of a case. People always ask, what's the deepest switch for gaming, or how do I get the most fuck out of my GMMK Pro? And frankly, there's fuck all that's going to do to save that. Switches are a very small part of the recipe in terms of a keyboard sound. The case and the foam are probably two of the biggest players. You should look for a case that sounds good to you, but you should look for a switch that feels good, because there's no magic bullet to getting a keyboard to sound deep. It's every part of the recipe. Now, if you have a deep sounding board, then you can start to look for switches that can match that, switches that are on the deeper end of the spectrum, and they can help accentuate its sound. But getting the deepest switch on the spectrum and putting it in a board that is high-pitched is not going to suddenly drop it. Anyways, back to the switches themselves. My rant is over. I just hate when people ask what the deepest switch is, not realizing that literally every other component plays a much bigger part in terms of sound. But anyway, I lubed my switches with Tribosys 3203. It's a little bit thinner than 205G0, and it helps a lot with tactiles because it doesn't remove nearly as much tactility while still providing that smooth actuation after the bump. Before installing a single switch or stab, you always need to test the PCB to make sure that all the keys work. This is to make sure that it's not dead on arrival, and if you do install switches into a board and then find out it's dead on arrival, you're SOL, because installing the switches breaks your warranty. So make sure you test it beforehand, or you will not be able to get a refund on a broken board. I already did this way before starting filming, but I forgot to mention it when I first took out the PCB. After soldering in a few in place where the stabs sit, I can place my keycaps on them to test for any issues. I already know my enter is warped, so I'll be fixing that later, but for now, this is just to make sure there's no other issues that I need to fix before fully soldering all the switches. After placing all the switches into the plate and making sure that they're all seated correctly, I flipped it over and began soldering. At first it may look like it's random, but I'm actually soldering one of the pins on a few keys around the board. This allows me to melt that solder and simultaneously press the key against the PCB to ensure it's seated fully. This will then pull all the other keys around it against the PCB as well. When doing this, I feel a distinct snap into place as the solder no longer holds onto that switch, and it presses against the PCB firmly. After soldering all the switches, you can then solder the 3 LEDs in the top right of the PCB. Now if you want certain colors to light the indicators specifically, in order from top to bottom, they are scroll lock, caps lock, and num lock. If you want the colors to matter, then there you go. Put the LED you want in the spot you want. If you solder them flush with the PCB, there's going to be a lot of light bleed into the other 2 holes. What I did was make sure that I was elevating them just enough to sit high and inside of the holes that the top case has to fit them. I then pulled them back ever so slightly, maybe a millimeter, half millimeter, just so they worked with the gasket mount, and then soldered them into place. This made sure that they were all elevated and as close to the holes as possible so no light leaked into the other ones around it. This is my personal preference. If you don't give a shit about it, then move on. Now, I don't know if you can tell or not, but there's no numpad on this board, so for the life of me, I don't know what they were thinking making that one of the indicators. Personally, I believe having layer indicators would have been more beneficial. Or a buddy also mentioned having 2 indicators and 1 layer, so it would be caps lock and scroll lock, and then while you hold your FN key, it illuminates the 3rd one. In the end, it's not a big deal since they're just LEDs, but I just think it's really stupid that they chose numlock for one of the indicators on a 65% board. Now it's in time to install all of the internals into the case. You can hold the PCB plate and switches off to the left side so you can access the cable and plug it into the PCB correctly, and then flip it over gently inside of the case. Now, when you place it back in the case, know that all the case foam will affect how much the board flexes. It prevents a lot of the flex, so if you don't want to add it, that's an option, but that does add risk of shorting the PCB when it hits the bottom case, since it's solder, and you now have no insulation. So just be careful. Now on to the main issue I have with this board. They didn't provide all the screws. You see, when I unboxed that novelty tray, it was bolted together with 4 longer thread screws. After unscrewing those, you find 4 duplicate ones inside of the box, and I'm assuming they wanted those to be the case screws for the keyboard itself. The problem is that they are too long. When you mount them onto the case itself, they sit proud and don't actually clamp the top and bottom together. However, the 4 that originally had it bolted together when I took it out of the case fit perfectly. They should be providing 8 of those 4 screws, and just forget the spare 4 ones that you kept inside that novelty box. They're useless. Anyway, if you have the board right now, I suggest just using those 4 smaller ones and just deal with it. The board's going to be flipped over anyways. It's a pain, and it sucks to see that that's the way you have to solve it, but frankly, until we get a fix, it's kind of pointless. So just use the 4 and leave it on your desk. For the keycaps, I'm using ePBT's Sweet Girl and Acid House, since my setup kind of fits the color scheme. As I had mentioned earlier, my enter was warped. Both of them actually were, both the original enter and the novelty. This is not the first ePBT set that I have ever received, and so far, every ePBT set I've used or messed with in some capacity has had something wrong with them, and this set is no different. This is not me bashing Yorkchan. I think they did a great job on the set. The color design is amazing. I just am sad they chose ePBT to make it. Getting the fingerprint sensor to function isn't hard at all, as long as you put the cable in properly, as long as you mounted it properly. It's mostly just downloading the drivers and then setting it up for your computer. Alongside that, the board doesn't need to be flashed with QMK. You just need to open up VIA, click the file button, open your key map, and load the JSON file. Overall, I believe it is a nice board despite the flaws with parts provided. The CNCing is good, the paint job is good, the PCB cutouts are strange, but they seem to be well done, and they function at evening out the feeling. I don't know the usefulness of the fingerprint scanner. It's originally advertised to help sign into your PC and make it faster. But if you're buying a custom keyboard, you probably like typing. And typing a password you have completely memorized feels like second nature. So, I mean, like, even for me, when I used the board, I would sometimes sign in normally just out of habit. The other thing that I can think of that would actually make this fingerprint sensor useful is accessing your other passwords. Like if you have Google set up to have your passwords and you got shit in there that is just unpronounceable via human methods, then yeah, I can understand this fingerprint sensor making it a lot easier. Alongside that, maybe payment authentication would also be a good one. As for the feel of the board, I would say that even without the case foam, you don't really feel flexibility as much as it helps with the consistency. It's more flexible than something like a 67 Lite, but much less than the D60 Lite or a Jelly Epoch. where it more just cushions the impact rather than having the entire thing bow to accommodate it. I do like the overall board, including the 1U right shift section, because in my opinion, right shift is the most useless key on a keyboard. Why would you use the inferior right shift when you have the superior left shift? It's just better in every way. And having this slightly ortholinear macro pad built into my 65% is perfect, for me at least. And that's about it. That's all I got. If you want to listen to it, the sound test will be at the end, but if you don't, then just go watch someone else, I guess. I'm sure someone's out there promoting some scam or some Raid Shadow Legends advertisement. Go watch that.